I think we're live, right? Let's just maybe wait a minute or two. I see the attendees list jumping by the second, so maybe we'll give it 10 or 15 seconds here. But yeah, excited to get started. All right, well, we are a minute over, so in the interest of time, let's get started. So, excuse me. Welcome everyone to today's webinar on the key retailer return trends of 2025. I'm Matt Hertz, co-founder of Third Person, and I'm here with Shauna Bowen, the Executive Vice President and Chief Digital and Transformation Officer with Radial, and Kyle Bertine, the co-founder and CEO of Two Boxes. I will allow both Shauna and Kyle to introduce themselves, but before we do that, just fair disclosure, I am an advisor of Two Boxes, so I do have an interest in their success. I wouldn't be an advisor if I didn't believe in their mission and believe in what they're doing. But just wanted to disclose that, and I'm also good friends with the Radial team as well. So with that said, maybe we'll turn it over to Shauna to allow her to introduce herself.
Yeah, thanks, Matt, and welcome everyone. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you're sitting today. I'm Shauna Bowen. I'm coming to you from Colorado Springs, Colorado. I am the Chief Digital and Transformation Officer for Radial. What does that mean? It's a lot of words. I'm accountable for strategy and transformation for Radial, the product component, as well as technology. So all three are under my remit. Just super happy to be here and looking forward to this session.
Shauna, thanks, Matt. Good to see you both, and thanks everybody for being a part of this. So, everybody, I'm Kyle Bertine. I am the co-founder and CEO at Two Boxes. I'm coming to you from not too far away from Shauna. I live in Denver, Colorado. We for those of you who are not familiar with Two Boxes, we partner primarily with third-party logistics providers like Radial, as well as merchants to help drive more intelligent, efficient, and profitable return processes for both 3PLs and brands. We like to say that we make returns an asset instead of a liability. Really excited to talk through the survey that we partner with Radial on today, and hope that everybody will make this kind of interactive with questions in the chat and the Q&A. So thanks, Matt. Thanks, Shauna.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Kyle just said, we do have that Q&A function on the bottom there, kind of right on the bottom of your screen there. So feel free to post questions in real time. We might address them in real time, but certainly we're going to save a few minutes at the end for Q&A. If there's certain questions that we don't get an opportunity to address, I'm sure Shauna and Kyle will be happy to address offline as well. So with that being said, we'll love to dig into things, and really excited to talk returns because it's really timely, right? I think we see that typically 30 to 60 days ish after the holiday season, and as the holiday season kind of comes even closer to where we are now in the calendar, it's really starting to kick off in the next few weeks. So this is incredibly timely, and we'll love maybe just to start with Kyle. If you wouldn't mind describing this Radial and Two Boxes survey data, essentially describing like what retailers are facing, like what's kind of the state of the union today with returns and how it's been impacting retailers.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. So first and foremost, we got this great opportunity to partner with Radial on a survey of retailers and merchants. And so just so everybody knows, there's about 200 retailers who responded across a variety of industries. So apparel, footwear, accessories, home improvement, health and beauty, electronics, kind of really every vertical. We did this back in the summer, back in July, and the size of the merchants was effectively between 50 million on the low end to about $1 billion of revenue on the high end. So a good cross section of a lot of the merchants that Radial and many others serve, but even up into like kind of the larger contract logistics space, which obviously Radial also supports. And I think we're going to dig in a lot more, and I won't steal kind of like anybody's thunder on the call, but I think it's sort of a few things that I'd highlight. The first is that returns are just not going away. So folks who were surveyed, the vast majority of them said that returns were either staying the same or increasing. And a fun fact that I like to share when I talk with 3PLs and merchants is that returns volumes, if you actually look at them since 2020, are actually growing 2 times faster than e-com volumes. And this year, actually, Happy Returns just released a great study on this. There's about $900 billion of returns that are coming back in 2025. To put that in perspective, that's like almost the size of all of e-commerce right now. So it's a massive right amount of volume, right? So it's just not going away. The second is that, very consistently we heard in the report that fraud and abuse are the number one pain point. So we're going to dig into what that means, but I think it's very important. Third, brands really struggle, I think, to get great return service from their 3PL. And many of them are, starting to, focus more on keeping this in-house or sending it to a specialist 3PL. And so I think, companies like Radial are obviously, doing everything they can to improve that and make sure that they are by far and away the best, service provider for their merchants. And I think the last thing is that, really brands are just not settling anymore. So one thing that really struck me in the survey results were that almost a third of brands are saying that one of the top reasons that they would pursue, ending their relationship with their current 3PL and moving to a new one is actually returns. And when people ask me why, I think it's really because if you look at the state of the union for a merchant, the world is so much different than it was 5 years ago. Right. I tell this story a lot. There's a unnamed brand CFO that I talked to when we were starting 2boxes, and I asked him if he cared about returns, and his answer was pretty much no. And the reason he said no was very, interesting to me and kind of on the nose was I buy my inventory at, X% of COGS in China. I ship it into the US duty free. It's not that hard to acquire customers, and all my investors are valuing growth over profitability. All of those things are not true anymore. So I think the average merchant right now really needs to manage this inventory much better than they did 5 years ago, because at the end of the day, it is inventory. So we'll dig into this a lot more, but those are really the highlights for me, Matt.
Yeah, no, it's great, Kyle. And Shauna, as a service provider, working with dozens and dozens, hundreds, maybe even thousands of brands, all of whom have different returns needs and percentage rates, et cetera. What are you seeing in the market? What is Radial seeing in the market?
Yeah, I mean, Kyle did a really good job highlighting a lot of the opportunities, and I just think it to add to what he said, there's not much because he did a really good job explaining. I think it is worth noting where you said kind of the 30 to 60 day window post holiday, big peak for returns. It is also important to note, and we'll get into this a little bit later as we dig into the fraud piece that Kyle had mentioned. But if you look at how holiday sales are now popping up, it's not just Black Friday, it's not just Cyber Monday, it's not just all of those, but we're already experiencing some of those sales early on in October, sometimes in September. And the reason why that's important is as you start to dig into what specifically like policy abuse and some other areas that you have to be cognizant of, these people may be shopping for their holiday season over a 3 month period, not just a 2, 3, 4 week traditional period, more and more, right? Especially with all the other macroeconomic pressures. And so that part becomes even more important as we think about how do we handle returns, how do we manage our P&L, how can a 3PL help provide some insight as to how brands can best manage them, et cetera. So we're starting to see a little bit of that surface up at Radial. Obviously, we'll get into some of the solutioning behind it later. But through data, the efficiencies gained of returns processing, et cetera, that's really the demand that we're starting to get to, because the macroeconomic component is changing so fast. We have to figure out different ways to be more agile to manage it.
Matt, I think you're on mute there, buddy. Happens to the best of us. I'm going to do it at least once
Darn,
on this.
darn.
Since 2020.
Yeah, at least that was only 4 or 5 seconds of talking to myself. Um, Sean, I was saying that not to digress from the report at hand, which we're going to dig into in a moment, but I am curious, just kind of at a high level, Shauna, um, what are you seeing with, given that you work, you support probably hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of GMV, of brands, fulfilling orders. Um, just like over the last, few years, maybe since COVID, are you seeing that like, not that I'm, necessarily the old guard, but I've been in the industry for about 15 or 17 years. And even as recently as 15 years ago, the sort of peak, Q4, from, Black Friday, Cyber Monday through Christmas, that was like, you know, all hands on deck, I mean, they called it Black Friday for a reason, right? The retailers, went into the black or turned green over that weekend. Are you seeing like a shift where, I think you mentioned that like there's a few events throughout the year. I mean, Amazon just had their like October Prime Day a couple of weeks ago. Like, is peak still kind of peak as we grew up, or has that kind of evolved and therefore like shifted the returns dynamic in the market?
Yeah, sure. So peak is still peaky, if you can use that as a word. Peak is definitely still peaky. And total consumer spend probably or total volume probably max out is probably just not as peaky. It carries throughout a little bit longer. But for a total amount, it's probably, similar type trends. And so usually you see it bleed kind of late Q3 and then through Q4 is where you see it. There's still a peak, and that peak is still, maybe it's not 5x, maybe it's 4x, 3.5x, 4x. But there's also these spot peaks, if you will, that you have to be accounted for. And so to my point about returns and the effect that that can have on it is people maybe just holding, waiting for the next best deal to decide whether or not this is the gift or this is what they're going to keep versus within that shorter window and then the 30 to 60 days post holiday. So it's just something you have to balance and account for.
Yeah, absolutely. Kyle, sorry, were you going to say something there?
Oh, I was just going to underscore, I agree with Shauna. I think we see the same, like peak is still peak. Average merchant on two boxes will see 2 to 3x the return volume during Q1 than they do kind of on a monthly average throughout the rest of the year. However, I think we're starting to see a lot more like kind of minor peaks throughout the year around specific selling holidays. And I think we also saw a decent amount of kind of promotional behavior this year that we wouldn't have seen last year due to the impact of tariffs. And so, yeah, I think it's going to continue to, sort of go down that trend of peak is still peak, but there's much more consistent return volume that 3PLs have to deal with year round.
Great. Okay, well let's dig into this report because that's why the 100 or so of us are here today. So Kyle, maybe I'll start with you here. We'd love to kind of dig into the top three pain points that were uncovered in the survey. So I won't lead the witness. I'll let you kind of address them. But yeah, excited to kind of dig into some of these key pain points.
Sure thing. So I'd say the big three are fraud, number one. And number two was honestly brands just trying to figure out ways to avoid returns, which is probably the best return policy for any merchant. Um, and then the third is timely refunds. And I think it's not just timely refunds. There's sort of some interesting results in the data. I think it's not just timely refunds. I'm going to call it quality of refunds. I think that's what merchants are really after. So fraud, I'm just gonna, hit a few points here. Something that's really interesting, as I said earlier, that return volumes on a GMV basis are growing at 2 times the rate of e-com volumes since 2020. Fraud is actually outpacing them both. Returns fraud is growing at 4 times the rate of e-com. And so I think when you look into fraud, people ask me a lot, well, like the fraud problem can't be this bad, right? Depending on which number you look at, whether it's from National Retail Federation, Happy Returns, Loop Returns, Narvar, Two Boxes data, best numbers I can give folks is that somewhere between 10 to 15% of returns are fraudulent. Now, fraudulent is typically defined as the old box of rocks, which we see all the time. Too few items returned, right? Somebody buys 3 and they return 2 and keep 1, hope that it's not noticed, or it's really abuse of the policy. Some folks in the industry have termed or have coined a term for this called friendly fraud, which is like bracketing, wardrobing, right? Just buying this shirt, returning it when it's clearly used and not in good condition for the next customer. That's definitely a big component as well. And so what I think we're seeing is that fraud is becoming a bigger and bigger issue over time. I think a lot of merchants want to bury their head in the sand and say that this isn't a problem. And another area that I encourage, 3PLs and technology providers when they're talking to merchants is don't ask the question of what is fraud. Ask the question of how many of these returns come back that you're refunding the customer in full that you shouldn't be. And I think when merchants start to think of it that way, they start to think of how much money is kind of going out the door in terms of fraud. And so it's definitely very real. And then the last thing I'll say on fraud before I'd love to kick it over to Shauna for any comments on fraud from her perspective is that I believe it's going to get worse, not better. And I could be wrong, but I think there's really two reasons I believe it's going to get worse, not better. Number one, the American consumer, I believe, is if you're not in the top, 5% of income earners, is under an incredible amount of pressure right now. And I believe that American consumers, on average, will start to use return policies more advantageously to their benefit to procure goods that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to afford. And then the second is that we're seeing massive generational shifts. So a big hat tip to Happy Returns. They publish this great study every year. And what's really interesting is that Gen Z actually returns at a rate that is 60% higher than boomers and 10% higher than millennials. 66% of Gen Z admits to bending the truth when returning, compared to 45% for all shoppers. And almost 40% of Gen Z admits to engaging in fake returns, meaning returning an item that they didn't buy, keeping items, or what's called fake tracking ID fraud, which is a very sophisticated form of label tampering to receive a return when you don't actually receive the items. So I think when you think about just kind of macro and generational shifts, I think we're going to see more, not less fraud. So anyways, that's my spiel on fraud. Shauna, what do you think from your perspective?
That's interesting. We did a similar consumer types facing survey, and relative to Gen Z, we definitely saw an over indexing. I think the point where you said it's like friendly fraud, it's almost like it's just a gray line. Maybe it's just some guardrails or guidelines on returns, not as kind of stringent, and there's an opportunity to negotiate, if you will. And so that your perspective on what to ask merchants as it relates to how much are you refunding versus what you actually should be refunding is a great way to think about it, because you can't just bury your head in the sand anymore, given the rates at with which returns are happening, especially under the greater umbrella of the fraudulent returns. So we're seeing very similar situations, similar survey results, et cetera. And it is quite interesting. And even for myself, as a consumer, and then I have a 16-year-old daughter that's a avid social media consumer. When she's looking to just buy her homecoming dress, she pretty much ignores the return policy. She's like, because that's just loose, right? They'll still take it, they'll do whatever you say, right? So it is interesting just in even her as a 16-year-old, her train of thought or line of thought as it relates to it. And so I can definitely see it manifest itself in real life. But it is real. And if you think about the consumer experience, brand equity, et cetera, we all know returns is an arm of what your brand represents and so on. We have to be cognizant of it. So
Yeah, Kyle, you mentioned this NRF Happy Returns annual study that they just released in the last few days. I actually posted something on LinkedIn earlier in the week, or maybe it was late last week. Just a couple points from the survey, and one of them was that retailers estimate that about 16% of their annual sales will be returned this year. So one of $6 generated in revenue will be returned, and that's totaling $850 billion with a B. And I think this was just US, although it could have been global.
US only.
Is it US only? Okay.
Correct.
So even more dramatic, right? And I mean, what's the GDP of, the United States. I mean, 25
Like seven,
trillion
20
or
trillion, something,
20
20, 25
trillion.
trillion.
So like this is significant, right? Not as big as healthcare, but significant. And this is just returns. Like this is an e-commerce volume, right? Or commerce volume. This is just returns, right? I think e-commerce in the United States this year will be about 1.2-ish trillion, right? And again, this returns is also offline, which is the majority of commerce, but like this is $1 trillion problem, right? Just this year. And as Kyle said earlier, returns are growing at a pace of, I think you said 2x e-commerce volume. So like huge problem. It'll literally be $1 trillion next year. So huge problem to keep our eyes on. Kyle, you mentioned like the fraud piece. I'm really interested in that, not because I seek to be a fraudster and to uh, uh, um, um, take advantage of retailers' policies, but I am curious, like what's a fraud tactic that you're seeing now that wasn't on your radar when you started Two Boxes, 2 or 3 years ago?
Sure. I think, well, first off, when we started Two Boxes, I mean, to be really fair, like my co-founder Evan and I, we knew a little bit about returns, but we knew a lot more about forward logistics, and so I think we learned a lot. And I think one of the biggest things we saw when we started was just like, I mean, just sheer, wardrobing was probably the biggest thing we saw, right? People just using the return policy as a rental and sending back, gobs and gobs of inventory. That was almost kind of mind blowing. You'd step into a facility like Radial's, size of Radial, where like they're serving big brands and there's lots and lots of damaged inventory coming back and seemingly nothing that folks were doing about it. I think the most, effective and pernicious thing that we've been seeing recently is what's called fake tracking ID fraud. That's really blown up in the last year or so. There's websites, normal websites, not like dark web, like crazy stuff. Normal websites that consumers can go to and effectively purchase fraud as a service. And so, really, these are sophisticated folks that understand how to tamper with, shipping labels to make it seem as though Kyle returned the item to a Radial facility, but it actually never shows up and it never will. And so they can use that to claim their refund with the customer service team. So I think for merchants on the call, my advice on this is first and foremost, this is not my quote, so I'm going to attribute it appropriately. There's a guy named Jordan that's the CEO of a company called Yofi that was actually just recently acquired. He says this, and I think he's 100% accurate, which is that your customer support team is now your front line against fraud, and enabling them with the right tools to make sure that they have information about what inventory showed up, consistent behavior across different, consumers, kind of just general strangeness in the order, details and the return details is going to empower your team to not just, give money back every time a fraudster tries to ask for it. And then I think the second thing that's really important is you need to partner with a best-in-class provider. Right? I think the Radials of the world are in an incredible position to empower their merchants to use great technology paired with world-class operations to improve their bottom line, right? And that everybody should win in that relationship. And so I think that's really my big advice for brands is there's some really sophisticated stuff happening out there. You're not going to stop it on your own. Work with great tech providers, but really importantly, good tech on its own is kind of worthless without great operations. So work with great operators as well.
Shauna, as a service provider, uh, I know that processing returns back at a warehouse is very expensive. It's similar in many ways to the outbound pick and pack, except that these are like each like it's imagine picking like truly eaches, right? And not like you don't have this concept of wave picking, right? You could pick 100 units of the same SKU and drop each one in 100 different poly bags, right? A lot simpler than returns where there's just a lot more scrappiness, for lack of better words. So I'm curious, like how does Radial balance the consumer expectation or experience with the operational costs of processing returns at the warehouse?
Yeah, I mean, it's again, it's just taking a little step back and calling out what Kyle had just mentioned. Returns aren't going away. It's real. The scenarios that he's described are real, and so at the end of the day, you have to control what you can control because there's going to be these other factors that are going to be a little bit more loose that you have to protect against, and so through that, having a separated, set aside out, really lean on processes, um, inspection, technology, all coming together, where it's the typical people process technology scenario is extremely important, right? And having somebody who can do it day in, day out in an effective and efficient way, not just for the merchant's P&L, but also for the consumer experience. Because as a consumer, you can't let it sit there. You don't want to wait 3 weeks from the time it arrived at a warehouse to actually be processed or refunded either, right? Which gets us into some other points about when the refunds actually hit and processing times, et cetera. But that's really where it matters. And I do agree specifically with Kyle. It's not just the operation. It's not just the technology. It's those combined that really are the sweet spot for being as effective as possible to manage the total experience for the consumer, most importantly, but then also not letting it negatively affect your bottom line.
Yeah. I want to talk about fraud a little bit. Excuse me. It sort of reminds me, I think at least some of us on this webinar probably remember Jet.com, which Mark Laurie started, and I think he sold it to Walmart, if I recall. And he started Diapers.com, and was a very successful entrepreneur out in New Jersey. And one of the kind of funky values of Jet.com was that um, when, as a consumer, when you would purchase something on Jet.com, you can essentially elect to forego or return. So in the checkout flow, you can select, basically opt in and say, hey, I will not return this. And they gave you some discount. I can't remember what it was. Maybe there was a percentage of the order total or, a few dollars, et cetera. But I thought that was incredibly innovative at the time, and this is probably 10 or 15 years ago. So, fast forward to today in the survey that Two Boxes and Radial just released, the survey showed that 69% of retailers claim that they are generally handling fraud well. But it's also the top returns issue. So in my head, I'm like, how do those two map together, right? That's like cognitive dissonance. So they're really not connecting that they don't really handle fraud well. So, what ways do most brands or I should say, in what ways do most brands like handle fraud today? Like, how should brands manage it differently? Kyle, you went into detail about how customers are abusing, fraud policies, and it seems like brands that I shop from, and not just Amazon, but non-Amazon brands, many of the retailers that I purchase from on Shopify or other platforms, like it doesn't seem like they might be aware of the fraud issues, but from a consumer perspective, they don't seem to really be combating that. So, Sean, I would love to kind of ask you, what are some of the techniques that you've seen successful brands do to really help challenge some of these prevalent fraud issues?
Yeah, so I happened to be working at Walmart when Jet was acquired, and so the example you just gave, it was absolutely innovative, and at Walmart we had looked to see how you could apply something similar, similar thought process, similar like kind of thinking out of the box mentality, and I think you do start to see it surface up a little, maybe how you return produce, and you know what, we're just going to give you the money back instead of you bringing produce back to a store, right? Like, what am I going to do with it once it's on my counter? So there's some nuances there that I think we can learn from others where it may be applicable in certain scenarios or just being innovative. Unfortunately, I would say a lot of retailers that we do see to prevent against fraud, it ends up because some of the fraud, a lot of the fraud that Kyle had described that came up in the survey was kind of consumer driven, if you will. There's that gray area, the guardrails, we kind of the friendly fraud. the unfortunately, sometimes folks just go back to being stricter on their policies, right? Which then has a negative implication on consumer experience. And so, whether it be, only a 10-day return window or a restocking fee or something to that extent. And so, where we're seeing, probably a little bit more success is maybe an upfront kind of fraud detection in advance, where maybe as long as it's done right, you can prevent the fraud from the bad actors, but still have an amazing consumer experience for the ones that aren't. Why spoil because there's a handful? Why let that handful of folks or fraudsters, if you will, spoil it for the rest of everybody that's the end consumer across the board. So to me, again, it kind of goes it goes back to this kind of technology and operational processes combined that can help create the right balance between minimizing fraud while maximizing the consumer experience, and ultimately resulting in a better bottom line result for the brand.
Yeah, and Kyle, how do you think brands could get more sophisticated with this? Are there certain tools that you and the Two Boxes team are working on developing to kind of help them combat fraud?
Yeah, totally. I think something we think about a lot is, if you were a merchant and you had this ability to, understand, kind of the full facts of the order and the return, before it happened, how would you treat that customer, right? And so, today, like, why is Amazon honestly pretty good at this overall? It's because they know your order history, they know your return history, they're vertically integrated, they can share all this information. And so I think, Shauna called out, there's a lot of really great pre-purchase tools. Companies like, Yofi, who was just acquired by another company called No Fraud, Signified. There's many others in the space that can help a merchant understand the risk of certain consumers even before they, complete a purchase. And so I think you can and should be using those tools if you're getting to, a large enough GMV, usually 10, 20 million in annual sales. I think where the industry is behind right now, and we're really keen to partner and help folks catch up is, well, there's also a lot of great data that you can get post purchase, right? So, what does the person actually say they're returning, right? What actually shows up in a building? And I think a big gap today is that there historically hasn't been great partnership from an operational perspective, but also a technology perspective between post-purchase returns tools and companies like Radial, right? Like Two Boxes can't generate great insights for a Radial merchant unless we're physically in a building empowering their team to process a return and collect the information about it in an efficient and intelligent way, right? So if you live in this world, and I think we're there right now, where a merchant that's at Radial could know, what does Kyle, the returner, say about his return when he's returning it? How does it get routed to the facility? Who actually receives it in the facility? How, what actually shows up? What quality is it in? What photos do we have of the inventory that came back? You can start to make much more strategic decisions around how you treat your cohorts of customers than you do today. And so I think that's a big opportunity for folks, and we're really proud to be partnering with a lot of the leading returns technology, providers like Loop and Narvar and Happy Returns, to kind of bring that future to today. Another thing I think you can do today, just as things that are available, out of the box that you can consider, and these are not. It's not a one size fits all for any merchant, in my opinion. But another thing you could be considering is, drop offs, right? Like if you physically tender a return in a storefront environment, via like a provider like a Happy Returns, that does have an impact on fraud, right? People are less likely to show up with a box of bricks to a Happy Returns location than they are, when they mail it in. And then what others you can start to think about, pushing some of the costs on your merchants. Companies like Redo are really kind of inverting the model to say, well, let's make the consumer pay for a portion of this, and I think they've seen a lot of success. But the future that we're going towards is, I think that merchants should be able to create tailored policies based on the risk of the underlying consumer, and that's really what we want to enable as we go forward.
Yeah, Kyle, I think when you and I first met probably 3 years ago or so, one of the things that we talked about in one of those first conversations was this kind of concept of a credit score, right? If I want to get a mortgage or a new credit card or something, like we can argue about whether credit scores are actually indicative of the health of an individual or consumer when it comes to spending. But this idea of like a sort of e-commerce credit score is really, really interesting, right? Like, does Kyle return across all the shopping he does on Amazon and any other marketplace on Carhartt, on Thursday Boot, all the places where he likes to shop? Like, what percentage does he return, and what do those returns look like? Right? And Kyle, you've made the point that uh, just because you're a consumer and you have a high return rate, it doesn't mean you're a bad consumer. In fact, you could be a really great customer for that brand, right? Like, not all returns are cancerous, right? And I think that's a really important point.
Oh, totally. There's actually there's some great data that we have from one of our merchants where, and in partnership with a company that I think might be on the call called Turn, where we were able to help identify for this footwear merchant that actually first time bracketing is more than likely to be a fantastic customer. If they buy three pairs of boots in three different sizes and they return them in high quality, that's much more likely long term to be a high LTV customer for you. But if you see consistent bracketing, that's actually usually a big problem. Um, and so I think that's really where we want to get to as an industry, is like these insights. But again, you don't get these insights unless you understand the physical process well and the physical inventory. And that's where partnerships between merchants, technology providers, and 3PLs like Radial, I think, are just incredibly, integral to solving these problems.
Great. Just a quick time check. We've got about roughly 20 minutes. If you have any questions, I know there's been a few that have been posted in the chat. Feel free to also drop them in that Q&A bar at the bottom there. I believe that Jack from the Two Boxes team has been answering a couple of them in real time, and we will have a few minutes at the end to address the questions. Shauna, a question for you. I know this report dove into apparel and footwear, or really really focused on apparel and footwear, in the ebook that you published a few weeks ago. Um, why were those, some of the categories that were really focused on?
Yeah, one in main in particular is we view apparel and footwear as probably the leader of facing everything as it relates to returns in general. They index that those categories index higher on a returns front. If you just think about sizes that across different brands are just different, right? I could be a size 6 in one and a size 8 in another. Same for footwear, et cetera. And so that was one. And then if you actually, it's worth double clicking to see how they responded relative to the total across all the verticals that we surveyed. And then when you actually look at the results, there was quite a flip, and I'll have to refer back to some of the flip that I saw. Unless Kyle, you have it at the top of your head, but it was. There was a couple that pushed down and a few that rose, I believe, with respect to policy abuse, wardrobing bumped up a little bit more, obviously, et cetera, relative to the pain points or friction points that they're experiencing. So, from our standpoint, it's just a little bit nuanced in the challenges space. So it was worth better understanding those ones in particular. And again, they seem to lead out a little bit in front, just because they experience more returns in general.
Sorry, Kyle, did you have something to add there?
No, I mean, I don't have much to add. I think it's also an area where I think there's a lot more subjectivity and kind of balance of consumer expectations. And so I think that's why apparel footwear tends to be just such a thorny kind of returns area. Just the volume, the consumer expectations, and a lot of the subjectivity that can come back, right? Like, how do you actually determine if somebody wore a pair of running shoes to go run for 30 days versus tried them on, outside one time? And do you want to penalize that customer or not? Right? It gets thorny real quick.
Yeah, I'm also like, and again, I know I mentioned Amazon a bunch, and I promise that I shop from non-Amazon places too. But if I'm average, then, an average US consumer, then 50 cents on every dollar I spend online is roughly Amazon. And there are certainly 3PLs like, Shauna's like Radial who support Amazon fulfillment, right? It's not just, FBA today. So I should caveat that. But I am so curious, like, so much of the stuff that I purchase on Amazon, which is largely commoditized, right? iPhone cases and cleaning supplies and toilet paper and nothing that's truly like unique and brand. When I do return, a share of those purchases, I've opened the Anchor iPhone charger box and I've already torn the tape on it and I've legitimately not used it, right? But I realized that, oh crap, it's not the right size or voltage or this, that, or the other. And I return it, pop it back in the box and bring it to my UPS store, half a mile away. And like, I know for certain that they're not re-merchandising that, right? I mean, they're selling it by the pound to these eBay resellers or, whatever it is, right? Sending up at a dollar store. So, uh, like, I'm curious, like order of magnitude, and I hate to put both of you on the spot, but I'm curious in your experience, Shauna or Kyle, like if like, or like even Kyle with your, with your clients, like what percentage of returns that are returned of inventory that's returned to a warehouse, what percentage of that actually gets put back on the shelf, so to speak, versus like landfilled or trashed or liquidated?
Yeah. So again, it's going to depend on the vertical, but generally speaking, the average is about 85% on two boxes. Now, a lot of that is apparel, footwear, accessories. What's really interesting to me is actually the correlation of like good returners and bad returners. Like we can actually track how many defects on a specific item come back by returner, right? And so what we tend to see is like 75-80% of returns just come back with no defects. Right. It's just like if anything, it needs to be like repolyed or retagged, and it can be put back to stock really easily. I think with like consumer electronics, with cosmetics, with a lot of other stuff, those return rates can be, or sorry, restock rates can be much, much lower, like less than 50% in a lot of cases. So it's really it's a huge, huge issue for sure. I don't know, Shauna, if those numbers jive with you.
Yeah, they do, and just to add, some of it's regulation driven too. If a seal's broken, you got to get rid of it, right? So yeah, for sure on the two that you, the one specifically one that you mentioned from a cosmetics perspective and a reduction. But yeah, in general, I think you would see, yeah, we see similar trends.
Yeah, one thing maybe I'll plug though that I think great operators like Radial do well is, like I said, there might be 75% of items that come back with no defects, but a lot of merchants are achieving 85, 90% restock rates. That doesn't happen without a great 3PL,
That's
right?
right.
Like you need to be able to give the proper instructions, the right QC, etc. And I think it's a win-win for 3PLs, right? If a merchant can pay Radial another X per unit to rebox a pair of shoes, clean it up a little bit, get it back to stock, that's awesome for Radial. It's also amazing for a brand, especially in this environment with higher costs and higher tariffs.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to hear that it's as high as 85%, Kyle. My guess would have been almost the inverse of that. Certainly a number that's a heck of a lot smaller than 85%. So if one out of six things on average is being returned, right? That NRF survey that suggested about 16% of spend is being returned, and you are putting back on the shelves, re-merchandising 85% of that, it makes it a little less painful. Um, Probably the last question from me before we get to some audience Q&A. Um, Maybe we can turn this conversation slightly more positively, although it has been a positive conversation. But how can retailers win at returns? right? I think we mentioned a few minutes ago that not all returns are bad. Returns happen, at times because of manufacturer defect, right? Among other reasons that the brand needs to know about. So, um, uh, uh, whether Sean or Kyle want to kick things off, but yeah, I'm curious, if you can sort of describe how retailers, engage with partners to, reduce the returns cost and whether it's manage fraud more effectively or really turn returns into a competitive advantage and sort of a good thing.
Johnny, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go back to the, kind of the drum that we've been beating through this is between, whether it be technology and processes combined. The level of transparency and visibility to data coming in from all angles is extremely helpful. Understanding what's expected, when, who it's coming from, that can help see some success. But then that married with, we'll call them SOPs, if you will, for the operator to then process fast, right? There's a prioritization that could occur based on timeliness needed. But then what Kyle just described as being able to preserve 85% to get back on shelf in the kind of apparel and footwear space, that's extremely important. I'll go back to something I said earlier, is at the end of the day, returns are here, like they're happening at a high rate, right? We have to figure out how we can control what we can control, recognize and acknowledging what is going on, whether it be fraud or other scenarios. You have to focus on what you can control, and what you can control is in the space of leveraging technology, advances in technology, along with the processes to really just kind of streamline and effectively process the returns as efficiently as possible. Again, with the primary focus on consumer experience while minimizing negative impact to the bottom line. So I named a few. I know, Kyle, I was going to save some for you to add to it as well.
No, that's awesome, Shauna. I mean, yeah, I think at the end of the day, the Shauna nailed it. It's really like this marriage of good tech and great operations. And another thing that I'll put in, and Shauna, I hope this isn't too controversial of a statement. I think generally speaking, if you're a merchant on this call, the dirty secret is like your 3PL on average really doesn't want to deal with your returns. Like they don't wake up every day and go like, oh my God, like I'm so pumped to deal with a footwear client with a 28% return rate and a 50-page SOP that they want me to follow when returns come back. And I think it's really indicative that Sean is on this call that like Radial's not, in that average right now. And so I think one of the things that you as a merchant should be doing first and foremost is understanding what are your needs as a customer and knowing what are you asking 3PLs to do, and then make sure that you really understand, is there going to be a true partnership there or not? Right? Because a lot of 3PL sales folks will meet you, they'll put a lot of things in our RFP, they'll say a lot of things, and then when the rubber hits the road, they're not actually going to do the job, and they'll miss SLAs and they'll have poor quality. And the answer at the end of the day, in my mind, usually tends to be there was just a total misalignment, like of incentives and pricing and structuring of that deal up front. Number one. Number two, there was usually a misunderstanding or just not a real partnership between the brand and the 3PL. Right? I say this a lot to brands. If you've never set foot in your 3PL's facility, you've never actually watched them process returns for like an hour or half a day, or God forbid, a full day when they come in, like you don't really actually understand what they're dealing with, and what you're asking them to do. So like really, I think it's important to like put boots on the ground, understand their processes, the limitations that maybe you're inadvertently creating for the 3PL, I think is really important. And then the last is like understand your technology needs, right? So if you are, if you need a really awesome exchange function, right? Then you should probably pick a different, there's like a couple RMA providers that I would say have an amazing RMA exchange provider or exchange functionality. You should work with them. If you really value drop-offs and consolidation, well, then maybe you should work with Happy Returns or somebody like that. If you really, require, I don't know, like re-commerce integrations, right? There's all sorts of different providers. So like really understand, what are you trying to accomplish? How are you trying to accomplish that? What are the best technical providers that you can use? And I think if you do those, three things well, like even the first two, just understand like who are you working with? Are they incentivized to solve this problem with you? Number two, do you understand the process that you're putting into a warehouse and what you're asking of a 3PL? If you do those two things well, I think you're 80% of the way to the problem, or sorry, the solution. And then the last 20% in my mind is like pick great technology and use it, because I think great tech is going to have a massive ROI for everybody involved.
Yeah, the next question I have here, I'm going to ask this somewhat judiciously, but um, either of you think that retailers are creating some of their own returns problems with overly generous policies designed to compete with Amazon? This kind of free, no questions asked, no strings attached, 90-day policy. I think Amazon might be 30-day policy generally. Um, yeah, are they kind of creating their own problems without the coffers of Amazon?
I'll give my perspective. I don't have data backing it, if you will. I do think there's a component of cost of doing business, and merchants have to weigh out the value of them controlling their brand, their customer service, et cetera, versus say fulfilling through Amazon. And there's a cost of doing business with Amazon as well, right? And so you have to kind of look at it holistically to understand by channel where you're going to deliver the most value to the consumer. That's also going to funnel through all the way to your bottom line. And so it may be a trade-off discussion with respect to that, where I can get more volume through retailer.com versus say an Amazon, while I may have to give up a little bit on the returns problems that maybe I do create for myself. Net all in, maybe I do get better bottom line value all the way through versus not. I do think that needs to be taken into consideration. So do I think that they're intentionally causing these problems? I think they probably know what the consequences are of some of the decisions that they're making. And I think, I would hope that they're looking at it and evaluating it in a bigger kind of holistic view versus singularly focused per channel, if you will, in that regard.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Just
mean, I
my
guess,
perspective.
yeah, I know. I think the question is like, are they intentionally creating problems? I don't know if they're intentionally. I think in most cases, a lot of well, again, anecdotal, not necessarily backed by like a full data analysis, but everything I've seen is, yes, I think on average, retailers and merchants create a lot of returns problems. And I think if I had to diagnose why, I would say number one is I have been doing this for 4 years, basically. I've only met two organizations in the last 4 years, and maybe there are more, but I've only met two that have someone whose title is that they are like the head of returns or like the VP of returns, like they own it, right? I think on average, the average like merchant, retailer, it's like the Spider-Man meme, like everybody just pointing at each other. It's like, well, the head of ecom wants this from returns, and the VP of operations want this, and the VP of finance wants that, and they don't actually, nobody owns it, and it's kind of just like whatever. So that's number one. I think number two is nobody actually, you can't improve what you can't measure. I think a lot of people just don't have the right data to like measure what's happening. Like I've met three brands, we serve about 500 right now, that I have actually created a returns P&L and understand like if a return is created, what is the economic impact to that? And so I think highly encourage people to be doing that if they're not. And then yeah, I think the third is like understanding sort of like the second and third order impacts of this, right? Like I was talking with a retailer this week, very, very large retailer that probably everybody on this call has purchased from it at least at some point in their life. Where they're like, yeah, we want to drive all of our returns into the store. The problem is like the average store only merchandises like 20 to 30% of the things that are bought online. And so all this inventory ends up in stores and we actually don't know what to do with it. And like to send it back to a fulfillment center is like a lot of times too costly for what it's worth. And so we end up just like throwing stuff away or putting it on like deep discount, right? It's probably not the best policy, but it's the one that's most effectual today. So anyways, I think a lot of people are causing a lot of their own problems, but you just got to measure it and decide where to go.
Yeah, great. We have time for probably two questions, two final questions. I'm going to get to Amanda's next. Amanda Smith has asked, with the holidays in mind, do you all have any historical data or insight into what most merchants are offering for extended return policies? Any perspective, Shauna or Kyle, even as a consumer perspective, not necessarily as a
Yeah.
as a supplier.
Yeah, actually, I think I'll do a plug here. I think Loop, could be wrong on this, is releasing like a holiday kind of like benchmark report, or has released one soon. I'd keep your eyes out for that. They know a lot. They have their finger on the pulse really closely with the Shopify ecosystem. My experience, usually an extra 15 to 30 days is about right.
It's about the same. Yep.
Yeah, I think Amazon, yeah, generally they offer about 30 days from, I think it's from the point it was delivered, which is usually just a couple days after you've purchased it. And during the holidays, just anecdotally, it feels like from around like the beginning of November, they kind of extend that through the end of January. So they kind of give you the better part of 2 or 3 months to return. Now, again, that's Amazon and not, an SMB, but yeah, definitely extended. One other question we got, maybe I'll kind of direct this to Kyle since you're at the forefront of technology and innovation and returns. But what innovation and returns are you most excited about for 2026 and beyond?
Oh wow. I mean, there's a lot. I plugged one earlier, which is like I believe we're going to have much more like kind of cohort driven return policies that are going to continue to get, launched into the market over the next few years. I'm excited about that. Another partner that we work with that I think does a great job is called Freight Returns, Frate. They have a pretty interesting, kind of like technology where a consumer actually takes a photo of a return when it's submitted, and that helps drive the policy, which I think is not super novel, but I think really cool in how they've executed it. And then yeah, I think Loop, Narvar, Redo, lots of them are introducing new things this year. Really cool. So there's a lot to be following for sure in the ecosystem.
Yeah. Great. One last question with the minute or two we have left here. This was asked earlier in the conversation, but Kyle, you were talking about this concept of like tracking ID fraud, which is new for me too. The question was, how do you monitor and mitigate tracking ID fraud?
Yeah, totally. So I would say first thing, start monitoring. So biggest things that you want to look for as a merchant is the difference between a carrier scan and what your 3PL or your warehouse actually receives. So, for example, if UPS says that they dropped off 1,000 units of returns yesterday, and Radial says we only processed 900 of them, and all of them have been processed, right? What is that 100 delta? Who are they from? What are the sizes of those orders, right? So there's a lot of things you can start doing manually as long as you have the right data sets to look into this. If you're past that phase and you want to start implementing something more automated, then the best tools that I know of in the market right now are well, actually the best one I know of is probably Yofi. So I would say reach out to their team. They're like ex Apple folks who ran a lot of the fraud group over there. They know way more than I'm ever going to know about this problem. So I would recommend you talk to Jordan and the team over there. And then also, if you want a little bit more, I'll drop in. There's a guide that we did on this. I'll just drop it into the chat. But Shauna, anything you wanted to add there?
I think you covered all the areas that we've that we're aware of and are looking at.
Awesome. Matt, any other questions that we didn't get to?
No, I think that was it. There might be one or two that we can cover offline, but yeah, as good operators here, I want to be sensitive to time and we consume the hour. So I appreciate everyone for joining us, all the attendees, Kyle and Shauna, for being great panelists. Hope everyone learned a lot, and I know the two boxes and Radial team will be circulating more information after this call. So thanks everyone for joining this afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Shauna, thank you. Matt, thank you.
Yeah, thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
See ya.